Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We'll get underway. I'm Paul Campbell in Geography and Distributed International Development Initiative. We're all very welcome here today to the Tidy Development Research Week. And you will all have flyers on your seats which list the program of events. Please attend those as much as you can. We're delighted today to have Nitasha Kaul talk to us. She's just fresh from the Kilkenomics Festival, I guess, in Kilkenny, which is a bringing together of comedians and economists, she just told me. And they found them.
I was the comedian.
Okay. And yeah, they have a good bit in common apparently. And Nitasha is an economist by training herself. She has a PhD from which university in the UK?
Hull.
From Hull University. She's also taught at Bristol, Bath, and a number of other colleges. She published a book, Imagining Economics Otherwise, with Routledge in 2007. She was a professional academic economist for a while and then decided she would put her talents to other uses. She was a novelist, journalist, artist. She's written numerous pieces in the popular press and other outlets. And she also wrote a debut novel, Residue, about Kashmiris outside of Kashmir, which was shortlisted for the Grand Asian Literary Prize in 2009. She's currently completing a manuscript about Himalayan politics and history, and she'll be talking to us today about economic development, democracy, and justice. So we'd love to join me in welcoming
I think if instead of listening to me, if you were, instead of listening to me, if you were to Google for, the news today, you couldn't, I couldn't depress you any more than the news would because of what's happening, as you're probably aware. Everybody in Ireland that I've spoken to since I arrived here late Friday night has just sounded so worried about what's going to happen to Ireland. Is Ireland going to default next year? And with what's happening in Greece and the financial crisis that seems to just not get over, I just think it's a very, very difficult time for most people around the world, and that's why what I'm going to talk about is going to be more about things that involve people, which I think that, and hence the title, talk about democracy and development and economic justice. Why do I bring those things together? I think that, first of all, it's not, I do that deliberately, like you would not normally, if you are, I'm assuming that most of you are involved in some or other sort of development-related research, right? Is that what you do? Yeah? Okay, right. So are there people here from politics departments, or like do you also engage with other literatures in politics or economics, or? Yeah, you do. So, okay, so then we're on the same page. My point is that what has happened over the 20th century is I think that we've had this move from okay, let me begin again. Scientism and disciplinarity, I think the rise of scientism and disciplinarity from the mid-19th century onwards, I think have been really damaging to the way in which we conceptualize questions of knowledge and what that has led us to in terms of how we formulate policy. And why I say that is it's not because there's anything wrong with being experts in certain fields. Of course, you need to be expert in a certain area. If anybody would tell me that something about Bhutan, for example, a country that I claim to be an expert on, then yes, I would like to correct them and say that it's not this, it's that. So it's not the expertise, it's not the fact of the expertise that I question, but I do question the way in which we have carved out realms of knowledge so that they become accessible only to certain constituencies of people. And I think that that's not as simple as it might sound. It just sounds like, of course, that's obvious. One ought to be thinking about people, but that's not how it actually plays out. Because, for example, I mean, when one goes to study a field like political economy, and economics was, as you know, before it was called economics, it was called political economy, and the reasons for the way in which the ideological function of knowledge in general has become so invisible are manifold. But sociologically, for example, in relation to economics, that has to do with the fact that a large number of people who were trained as engineers, or who saw physics as being an important field in late 19th century, tried to put their talents to use in economics. So you have the first generation of neoclassical economists who are trained in things like, or interested in things like, actuarial science. Walras, the important French, one of the founders of neoclassical theory, was trained in actuarial science. It's the same with a lot of the other important people that were foundational in the setting up of economics. Like, for example, Alfred Marshall, who was at Bristol, and from whom we get the whole concept of demand and supply and the Marshallian cross, resented really that there was another professor at Cambridge called Seeley, who would, Professor J.R. Seeley, who would comment on issues of economic importance. And for Marshall, it should have been something that should have been reserved only to the special domain of people who were trained in economics. So all that sort of, that is just one part of the wider current in the way in which scientism and disciplinarity became really important in the late 19th century, and economics as part of that process became sanctioned as a process of colonization and of management. So one needed to create a certain kind of science at home in order to be able to apply that overseas. And it is not coincidental that the rise of neoclassical economics and the heyday of Victorian imperialism and subsequent colonization of large parts of the world, in the name of that kind of application of management ideology, like monetization, for example. One good example is the way in which similar sorts of rationales were used in different parts of the world to say that this makes economic sense. And but in one part of the world, you could be told that you should grow cash crops rather than what you're growing, in Kenya, for example. In another part of the world, this would mean like moving to rubber plantation. The rationale given in each of those cases was it makes economic sense to do that. But it wasn't just economic sense. What was happening was that, and it's important to trace this history, because that's where a lot of the force of economic rationality comes from. And that force of economic rationality is also partly that has fed into the development discourse over the 20th century. The post Second World War period, which is now we talk about things like post development. We question, there are feminists who question the idea of imposing and imposing demographic norms and curtailing people's reproductive rights in large parts of the world. Now we question that, but for large parts of the 20th century, what has happened is this wholesale application of a very ideological way of thinking upon populations that were told that this is the rational thing to do, this is the economic thing to do, this is how you grow and develop. But as we know, the ladder of development, or the ladder of competitive advantage, wasn't a ladder, it was a spiral, and in a lot of cases downward spiral. And some of the countries that ended up doing best were countries that did not follow the norms. Where does democracy come into all of this? Some sense is going to emerge out of all of this, but the reason I've put together democracy, development, and economic justice is fundamentally I want to question the origins of democracy as being the best possible way of governing populations, and thinking that there's some kind of export package that we can somehow combine democratic norms with a certain secular way of thinking, with development, and that would somehow then result in a welfare of large number of people and ultimately deliver economic justice. It hasn't worked out that way, and we only have to look at any example from around the world to see how it hasn't worked. And the fact that we're having now this financial crisis in the West, after this great period of great moderation, doesn't take away from the fact that in large parts of the world, the crises have just been ongoing. So if you read about the fact, and part of why we can't see the ideology of it is because we have failed to locate the very sources of value in labor. I'm sure, well, perhaps you know about the fact that in India, a country that I originally come from, Kashmir, Kashmir, on the Indian occupied part of Kashmir, that in India there has been a huge amount of in India there's been a huge amount of kind of insurgencies of various kinds. You know about the Naxals in India, right? The insurgencies that have focused on the fundamental issue of land rights, people being able to claim that development is not going to deliver. We do not want this mountain or this forest to be converted into a mine. We just don't want the kind of life that would enable us to have. What do you do when populations simply reject that idea of development? In China, I'm sure you know that there are like tens of thousands of riots every year in the rural areas, again based on the issue of land. And so the way in which from, say, like Enlightenment onwards, and specifically from mid-19th century onwards, we have tended to focus on the sources of value as being some kind of abstract utility, which is, I can refer you to. I mean, I couldn't do better than referring you to the work of an amazing economist, an economic historian called Philip Mirowski. If you haven't read Mirowski, that's just go and look at his work, because it shows you how all of this is just so connected. For example, like going back to I will come back to the India and China question, but what I find most appealing about Mirowski's work is that he's saying that, and showing conclusively how there has been a term-for-term translation from field theory of value to the theory of value in economics, like literally term for term. So energy becomes utility, and each of those equations gets transported into economics in a different sense. And what that results in is that somewhere along the line, the ideology becomes invisible and people become invisible. And it is important to keep pointing out how that obscuring of people being at the heart of the entire process of development, of knowledge, fundamentally the questions of knowledge are questions of social order. Why do you want people to develop? Why do you want people to develop? You want them to develop because you think that people want to have a better standard of living. You want to make sure that they're not living on less than $1 a day. But in one of the rural, in some rural areas of Bhutan, for example, $1 a day is not so bad, because not a lot of your interactions with the world around you, they're not monetized. Community plays an important role. A lot of labor is voluntarily supplied. There are natural resources, and there is a fundamental harmony and a balance that has not been disrupted to the extent that you need to have enormous amounts of money to actually undo the process of growth. I was in the as I was coming into Dublin, the person who was driving the car was asking an economist in the car, an expert on European finance, how do we get out of this? And this person said, well, growth just heals everything. What you need to do is just grow and grow and grow, which means what is important is that you need every year you need to show that the GDP is improving, that more is being produced, more is being consumed. Governments are asking you to spend your way out of a recession, when it's convenient, of course. But what that obscures is where that is getting us. The reason I'm bringing up Bhutan, it's a small Himalayan country at the eastern end of Himalayas, is because of this whole concept of what is called GNH, which I'm sure you've heard of. GNH, gross national happiness. So the idea is that it's not, and that is the official aim. Also, the Planning Commission is called the GNH Commission, for example. And the official aim of government policy is not to have a greater GDP, but to follow the kinds of policies that maximize people's welfare in terms of how happy they are, how much well-being they feel they have. In some sense, you could relate it back to things like, the capabilities approach, that, what Amartya Sen's capabilities approach, and what it's not what you have, it's what it allows you to do, and what it allows you to be, the kind of person it allows you to be. And I think that is something that is going to become more and more important for the world at large. And if we do not recognize that, then we're somehow failing to see everything. It's like a house of cards collapsing all around us. Now, I was asking some people that that I just met here, how are the Occupy movements over here? And I was told it's just five tents outside the bank. So I haven't seen that. I don't know how that works. But I have been involved with the one in London, and I know that that's taking a very different direction. And they've set up something called the Tent City University. And what we're doing is and this is like PhD students from Oxford, from around the country, are trying to have experts and activists come and sit and talk together, because a lot of the times the problems are that people have concerns, and those concerns are then reflected in the academic discourse by an entirely different set of people who do not talk to each other. Or if they do talk to each other, then those concerns do not filter down to people whose lives are affected by all of this. So the connections between, I think, neoliberal practice over 20th century, the connections between neoliberal practice, neoclassical theory, and a certain kind of social Darwinist metaphysics have not been looked at enough, and we need to uncover that. We need to see the role that the academic practice of fields like hardcore fields like economics that are seen to have a purchase on our economic lives, the role of that kind of neoclassical economics. It's linked to neoliberal practice, which is how the governments function and what sorts of policy prescriptions get put out and what sort of advice they get and how that is followed in practice, and a certain kind of social Darwinist metaphysics that allows us to think that, yes, it's, if you survive, it's fine, it's a meritocracy. If you don't, it's at some point it's your fault, and if you didn't make it, it was somehow not, it was somehow your fault partly in the process. And, sitting in this room, we might think that that's not really the case, but you only have to interact with large numbers of people outside in the real world to realize that that's actually still very true. You still have students in England, for example, saying that I don't mind education being restricted to a certain set of the elite. This is a real example from Bristol University. I don't mind education being restricted to a set of the elite because that makes our degrees more valuable. That makes us be more able to generate value. So it engenders an entire moral universe, a particular kind of moral universe where it's okay not to care, where it's okay to think that, yes, if I make it, that's good enough. And then there are these progressively widening concentric circles of who you care for. So I should be okay, and then my family should be okay, and then my community should be okay, then my nation should be okay, and then everybody else can, it's like too far to care about the problems of the world. When I was more intensively involved with the academic discourse of economics, I found fascinating parallels with all of this in the very first Enlightenment thinkers, and people like Smith, who said it was, if there was an earthquake in China, why should I care? If I have an injury in my little finger, that's of far greater value to me. It sets up the maps of affiliative concerns that fundamentally determine what we do and how we do it. So if it's happening somewhere else, it's not our problem. If it's happening here, it is our problem. And one way in which that is playing out right now with the financial crisis is that each country is trying to, aside from the Stability Fund and all of that, in spite of that, each country is trying to deal with that from within their own national borders, not recognizing that global financial health is something that is a global public good. And that unless there is unprecedented levels of coordination, cooperation, and perhaps an entire revisiting of the Bretton Woods institutions, nothing's going to get solved. We're just going to have, we'll just deal with one little bit of the crisis until the next wave comes, and then the next wave comes. So I think the importance of collaboration and recognition of these sorts of trans-border issues is going to be the fundamental challenge of the 21st century. Where does democracy come into all of this? It is because we think that if you have, America, but also a lot of the other nations think that you can simply go and export democracy to a country. Once you have elections, once elections happen, that is then going to then you can set in motion a set of policies that will deliver development, and that will, like I said before, and that will enable some kind of justice to come about. It's wrong, first of all, because I'm very cynical about democracy as a system, because it doesn't there are large parts of the world where you've had development without democracy. So, what is officially called development without democracy. Or you've had democracy, but not economic justice. And this is coming back to the example of India in this case, that you've had, we've had like 60 years of elections and, people's representatives being in parliament, and the entire system seems to function along those norms. But in terms of economic justice, it's delivered very little, and it's getting progressively worse because it is immiserizing large sections of the population, the ones who have the least voice in the system, to actually be able to say anything or do anything about it. Hence, the struggles around, which are fundamentally, which are fundamentally struggles around identity in one form or the other. Whether it's the Naxals who are fighting for land rights, whether it's the Dalits who are fighting because of identity-based oppression, or whether it's people who are just progressively becoming poorer or getting locked into certain levels of existence that they cannot then break out from. It determines their life chances in a very fundamental way. So some of the facts about democracy that we know are wrong. To begin with, it's not something that comes from, I refer you to John Keene's book. Democracy is not something that comes to us from Athens. And he's done this, 10 years of research into this huge big book that in which he argues that from about 2500 BC to about 900 AD, there were examples of what could be called democratic practices in several other parts of the world, and he defines that as the age of assemblies. And from then onwards till modern times, it's the age of representative democracy. And then he says we're now moving into an age which he calls monetary democracy, which is where people increasingly ask. Monetary democracy in the sense that people increasingly monitor and ask difficult questions of their representatives. The expense scandal in the UK, for example, revealed that a lot of people just got very, very angry and wanted to do something about it. So first of all, democracy is not a Western invention. It isn't something that comes from ancient Greece alone. I mean, part of that story is the whole Martin Bernal and Black Athena thing, which you might know of, which traces even the roots of ancient Greek civilization in the Egyptian civilization that came before it, and how that has been to a large extent deliberately overlooked in scholarly discourse, and the role that and what that has resulted in. So we have to be very suspect about the origins of democracy. We have to be far more rigorous about tracing the evolution of democracy in different parts of the world. And we have to be very aware of and critical of the promise of democracy. So just because we have the idea that people can go to vote, it's the same thing as going to a church. You just go there and you put something there. That doesn't necessarily mean that people are being represented. Because in the political realm, the notion of representation that we had, which is that this person goes and casts a vote, loses value when the parties just get more and more mainstream, and you have fringe parties, and you have very little choice between those parties, which is why a lot of people opt out of the system, are now opting out of the system in countries around the world or cities around the world, and saying that our political leaders do not represent us and we need something different. So first of all, we need to be suspect about this concept of democracy. Secondly, what is development? Now, development is historically has been linked to growth. So if you, in some measure or another, that you cannot develop unless you have more growth, has been linked to following a certain set of policies that again enables you to, but you know of the work of the Cambridge economist Ha-Joon Chang, that the kicking away of the ladder of competitive advantage, that once you actually get there, for a lot of countries, once you get there, the ladder is kicked away. So it's not like every country can follow the same process. Yet, if you look at the academic discourse on it, it is as if you just keep following that set of prescriptions, you will develop. But you don't. And thirdly, the relationship of development to spatial organization and relationality. Development has come to mean greater connectivity. So you have better access to services, you have more telecommunications, electricity, things like that, being able to get an education. Yes, all of that is important. It gives you a certain kind of spatial organization that gives you connectivity. It does not give you relationality. And that relationality is not going to come about in and of itself. That needs a certain kind of mindfulness, an awareness that development is not delivering that. And so in that context, one of the best definitions of development that I have ever come across is that development is a change in relationships. Fundamentally, development is a change in relationships. It changes how one relates to one's own environment, how one relates to the people around us, and what sorts of expectations one has of that environment that one inhabits. And once you look at it like that, once you sort of change the paradigm on what development should mean, once you look at it as change in relationships, then you have to think of what sort of changes do I want, and how do I want those relationships to change in my environment, and what do I expect out of those changes? And then you start to think that it's not the same thing where you are in the entire spectrum. Development would mean something very, very different to you, depending on how you relate to people around you, what sort of environment you are in, what latitude and longitude you are in, sometimes even what altitude you are in, and what are the things that are important in your immediate environment. So we have to move away from this kind of universalist, prescriptive, dogmatic, to a certain extent, model of development, which tells us that this is what we need to do. And doing that would be good regardless of where you are anywhere in the world. I mean, yes, of course, I make it sound simplistic. It's a lot more nuanced than that. One doesn't want, on the one hand, it is true that once you have better health diagnostics, yes, you do recognize more disease. On the one hand, it is true that yes, a lot of people who had incurable diseases get cured more once you introduce more advanced medical practices. But on the other hand, it's also true that you make certain new kinds of illnesses come into being that did not exist before and that were not recognized as being illnesses in the same way. So, I mean, that whole Arturo Escobar literature and all of that. But thirdly, so that's democracy and development. And the third point that I want to talk about is economic justice, which is that I think instead of focusing on democracy, instead of focusing on development, what we need to be talking about more and more is economic justice. We need to talk about what does one get out of one's existence in a modern, capitalist, developed society? What is it that it delivers in terms of a person's life satisfaction? And what sort of a mindset does that then give them or confer upon them in relation to how they think about people who are not in front of them, who are not immediately, who are invisible to them, in other words. So, and I don't mean here the theories of justice. I don't mean that, we have to go and look at how Rawls looked at it. And, yes, perhaps if you want the footnotes and perhaps if you want the bibliography, fine, go ahead and do that. But my point is that there is a certain kind of cosmopolitan vision that is central to the question of economic justice that we cannot ignore. Because supposing it were irrational and uneconomic to do something, but it was morally right. That's kind of like the dilemma, and that is a very important dilemma that not so much economists or maybe development practitioners, but people in other fields have looked at. What happens in a situation like that when you know that yes, it is going to create jobs, yes, it is going to bring about livelihoods, yes, it is going to improve people's standard of living, but it's not right. What do you do? Do you then make the choice? It's not right because it's in some ways sort of maybe hurting people elsewhere, people who are not within that, people who are not voting for you, in other words. So to take the simplest example, yes, you set up this really deadly arms factory and it creates a lot of jobs. It makes, it makes a town be very prosperous. But then a lot of, there are a lot of statistics that tell you exactly what percentage of people around the world are maimed or killed or harmed by weapons produced in a certain country. And if you look at that, it's pretty striking. So I think that moving beyond the abstractions of the theories of justice, we need to have a much more human conception of what it means to be economically just. And we need to have a conception of the kind of violence that is enabled by thinking. It's just nonsense to think that ideas do not make a difference. But you'd be surprised at how many people still think that. Because the violence of ideas can only be countered by rethinking those ideas in a different sense. And when we say economic violence, on the one hand, I mean, I was surprised 2 years ago when the G20 happened in London, and at the same time, Obama administration set up this very special secret group whose charge it was, and this is way before the Arab Spring, which was tasked with the idea that you have to go and monitor incidents of economic violence around the world. What that meant was the kind of violence that is caused by people being in dire economic circumstances. And, it might have been prescient because, 2-3 years later, you have this entire Arab Spring. At one level, you could say being triggered by this, although, of course, versions differ, but by this person, this fruit vegetable seller who immolated himself and who was subjected to violence, and how that sparked the entire thing in Tunisia and then spread to Egypt and everywhere else. So that is one way of looking at economic violence. But I think a far more important way of looking at economic violence that policymakers do not do is to look at how specific economic ideas enable violence to be carried out in their name. So how a certain kind of idea of what the returns to labor should be, for example, or what it means to be growing, or what it means to have a certain level of return on a certain enterprise, how those kinds of ideas cause violence in people's lives. Sometimes it's way more literal, of course. Last year in Zambia, there were the Chinese managers that shot at workers. And right now, even as we speak, in India, there's this big case that about the Maruti factory and the strikes in Manesar. And in those cases, the workers are either fired upon or beaten, or it's real physical levels of violence. It goes even beyond the kind of violence that unemployment causes, or breakdown of social relationships causes. It is real physical violence that is caused by economic injustice. And I think that we need to find, and I do not have the answer, but I think we need to find some way of conceptualizing that far more rigorously than we do right now. And we can only do that if we place economic justice right at the center of everything, democracy, development, all of that should be around the fundamental core idea of economic justice and how you deliver that. Because it is just simply unacceptable to, I think, and should be unacceptable to live in a world where there are just so many contrasts of wealth, so much concentration of wealth in a certain section of the population in certain countries, and it's not even a country's thing. It's not like people at the weekend were talking about, why should Greece help? Why should Germany help Greece? It's not about Germany or Greece or the US or Ireland. It's about a certain level of a certain class of transnational elite in Germany, in Greece, in Ireland, in the US, in India, in China, whether colonial, ex-colonial, post-colonial, a certain level of elite whose interests have fundamentally become completely disconnected to the political processes in the countries that they inhabit. So there is no way of capturing that meaningfully within the concept of democracy, because they do not, they might physically live in a country or spend certain amounts of time in a certain country, but that has no value because political citizenship has lost value in that sense. A lot of, sometimes people facetiously suggest it, but it's not, but a lot of people would just want, just have the rich people come here, pay a lot of taxes and live here, and that's fine, as long as we get, it'll be good for the economy. So in a certain sense, the entire idea of political enfranchisement that was the driving force behind the last few centuries of thinking and policy and government has changed, because that political enfranchisement doesn't have the attraction and the appeal it once had. It doesn't matter. You could be poor in the best democracy in the world, but if you are poor, the fundamental fact is that you are starving, that you will not have food for the next time that you want to eat, or you will see people die simply because of hunger. So I think that the hegemony of discourses, and in this case, the important discourse that I keep thinking that of all the social sciences, the really important discourse of economics, the hegemony of that discourse relies upon its relation to a certain kind of forgetting. And when we forget how that hegemony came to be, then we are enabling it to continue. And that is why it is important to look at the very origins of modernity in the Enlightenment, to look at the very changes of thought patterns that happened in the 19th century, and how that sanctioned economics as a science to be this powerful force. When I say economics as a science, I mean a certain kind of economic logic that becomes this really powerful force in the 20th century, and how that impacts how that hegemony impacts upon people's lives. In the journal of there was this paper that studied how many articles in the Journal of International Economics over the last 40 years. Somebody did an analysis in this Journal of International Economics. How many articles referred to poor or poverty in the period of 40 years? Can you take a guess at a percentage? Any guess? How many articles do you think?
10%.
1%. There was just 1%. I can give you the reference to the entire article. So it's a formal analysis that statistically looks at this and what each term might have implied. And less than 1% of the articles over a period of 40 years actually referred to poverty. And this is not, and the paper is called Where Are the Poor in International Economics? Because the idea is, the title of the paper is Where Are the Poor in International Economics? And you should look at that because the idea is that it's not simply that if we don't talk theory, if we do statistics, if we do empirical stuff, we're going to somehow, the moral concerns are somehow going to come to the fore. They're not going to come to the fore. It's not going to happen unless you make it happen. And in order to make it happen, what needs is some kind of tweaking of the very processes from which we begin to think about why we think about those things and why they matter. Like I said at the beginning, why should it matter? Why not live under a dictatorship? Why live under or why live under a democracy? The fundamental question is what it enables in a larger sense. Secondly, when I look at again, from personal experience of the London riots that happened earlier this year, one sees increasingly the breakdown of the rule of law in societies where you would have expected that rule of law not to have been challenged in those circumstances. And again, a very good indicator of the levels of economic injustice that are enabling that to happen. One could say that these were young people, they were misled, they were drunk, they were just out to loot shops. Yes, all of that is true. But at some level, it's not even about the government cuts, of course, those cuts are savage and terrible. But at some level, it's simply about the fact that it's a breakdown in the fundamental rule of law, in the way in which we relate to each other, in the way in which we conceptualize society as a whole. And as people who are scholars, as people who generate the knowledge that then feeds into policy and vice versa, we cannot sort of log out of that. We cannot log out of that responsibility. We can't say that that's not our problem. It's not our problem because that's not what we do. If that's not what we do, why don't we do it? And then what's the value to what we do actually end up doing? So first of all, we need to disaggregate these very specific things. And secondly, we need to again revisit the sources of value in society. Why is it that something is valued at the way in which it is, remuneratively, but also otherwise? Why is it valued in that way? And the standard sources of the standard literature on that would tell you that it has to do with the returns to the marginal returns to a factor of production, to a factor in the production process. But that's not an adequate explanation if you look at it, because the returns to labor in the process of production have consistently gone down, and even theoretically, it's morally not acceptable, but theoretically inexplicable why we should continue having that as the basis for a world where people work, but they still end up living below the poverty line, and governments have to intervene to actually redefine the poverty line, which in the case of, there was this big furore in India recently where the government defined the poverty line at something like, I think, first it was 26 rupees a day, and then they revised it up after an uproar to 32 rupees a day, on which you could not survive, on which it's impossible. But why it needs even policymakers to tweak that, simply to be acceptable, simply to be seen that something's being done, but actually nothing's being done, and people are being immiserized further and further. Secondly, the point that free markets, and this is again the development and democracy link, that free markets are not, another bit of recent research, that free markets are not inherently superior to as a mechanism of promoting growth. So from the 1970s onwards, when you look at what has been happening in most of the countries, you see that yes, liberalization happened in a lot of these countries. Inflows were capital markets were liberalized. Lots of foreign direct investment happened, and that led to more growth. And that is therefore the narrative that we build around it. And so that when there is a crisis, what we need is more growth. We need more liberalization because that is going to help. It isn't going to help because even in the historical narrative, that doesn't hold true. So if you look at, in fact, in most of these cases, governments actively played a role in making sure that that markets, the control of markets over large sections of society became greater. So it's not as if the government stepped back and the market stepped in. It's actually the government's enabling the markets to extend their purchase on large sections of the population. And again, I can refer you to what the literature that I'm referring to here. Thirdly, I mean, it frustrates me no end. I'm sure you're not, you're development people. I'm sure you don't look at it like that. I hope you don't look at it like that. But the idea of a machine, the idea of this very way of looking at things in a mechanistic way. Of course, popular culture is flooded with that. You have the box of the economy. You have this kind of this quantitative easing, this much money coming in, either the interest rate being fed in, either the banks are passing it on or not. A certain level of growth, is it being delivered or not? It just gets reduced to the statistical aggregate of numbers and arrows where something leads on to something else and something else and something else. But the point is, if you fundamentally conceptualize of something as a machine, that is, in other words, a mechanistic way of looking at things, because mechanistic linked to machine, one does not expect machines to be just in delivering their outcomes. Systems can be just because we can do something about the fundamental metaphor of the system. But a mechanistic way of looking at things just rules out any moral consideration of what it means to be just. And therefore, in that conceptualization, we cannot expect economic justice to come out of a mechanistic viewpoint of a society or an economy, because that's simply not the job of the machine. The machine is a powerful metaphor that locks us into a way of thinking where we do not look at justice as something that is required to have to come out of this process. And therefore, that the three things that I think, corruption, poverty, and policy design, I think those are the three things three areas that need to be really focused on keeping economic justice at the heart of it. Because corruption in standard economics, we do not have a good way of looking at corruption. Corruption is it's rent-seeking behavior, and therefore not per se a problem. Secondly, there is one has numerous examples of cases where corruption can coexist perfectly well with neoliberal regimes, and in some cases it might just be the way in which you make the system work and make it better. And I met some people from Italy and Spain, and they were telling me that in Italy it's very, if you generalization of course, but to a large extent true in probably some other countries with high levels of corruption as well, that if you are somebody who's corrupt and able to get your way around the system, people look up to you because that is the only way you can get work done within that system. So it becomes an accepted fact of life, and the increasing levels of global corruption that in some countries ordinary citizens have to face. Of course, in a lot of the post-colonial countries, people face that on a day-to-day basis. In some of the Western European countries that we inhabit, we don't have to face it so much on a day-to-day basis, but there are still enormous levels of corruption, and which take all sorts of forms. So I'm sure you read the ActionAid report that said that 98 of the top 100 companies that are listed in the FTSE use tax havens, and that together those entities amount to something like over 8,000 subsidiary companies, and they're all based in these offshore. That's 40% of their overseas operations, and that essentially that means they're not paying taxes. That's not just tax. That's not just avoiding the taxes. That is a level of corruption. That is something that is being enabled by conscious policy, or at least not being restricted by conscious policy. And why we do that? Again, it's the same thing like the pollution haven hypothesis kind of thinking. That yes, if we do something about it in the city of London, it'll go to Switzerland. If you do something about it there, it'll go somewhere else. And what that means is that there's this kind of moral hazard where everyone can say we can't do anything about it because if we do something about it, somebody else won't. Going back to that whole issue of the global public goods. And perhaps the consciousness of that, I think, needs to emerge, therefore, more from technology is a big help, but more from the ground up, more from people who are not leading their countries or being politicians in parliament or governors of central bank. The consciousness of that, I think, needs to come from the very mechanisms, the pedagogical mechanisms of knowledge creation that you are involved in, that you are going to create the knowledge. So it's not some leader that's going to come and deliver and have better policy. It's actually the words that you write on your Microsoft Word document, and who you say those words to and what that makes them do. because the function of knowledge just simply cannot be underestimated. So corruption is one thing in various different forms around the world. Secondly, poverty. That it's just not. It's easy to talk about. It's easy to talk about things like the things that are improving, but not ask the questions of how things are worsening for so many people in around the world, just simply worsening. Because and it's not just an isolated protest on an environment here or an isolated protest for labor rights there. It's this groundswell of just loss of faith in the systems that surround us that has led to and like I said, I mean, in academic discourse, the focus on poverty is how to yes, there's the theoretical talk about how we conceptualize poverty and what the level should be, but there's simply one kind of dimension missing, which goes back to something like if you think of 1930s, to something like the full employment discourse. I mean, once upon a time, we lived in a world where it was acceptable to talk about full employment as the goal of policy. And full employment didn't mean that 100% of every single person in the country was working, but it meant that there was full employment as a conscious goal of policy. Just in the same way in which people argue that the goal of economic science should be fundamentally to start from the process of looking at provisioning. How do we provision for populations? If the reason governments came into being, modern states came into being, was to make the life of human beings not be nasty, brutish, and short, we've failed, because the life of human beings is definitely right now, to a large extent, very nasty and very brutish, and in the most horrific kinds of ways. I'm sorry. Were you saying something?
5 minutes.
Okay. I'm not saying that there's bad faith on the part of, I mean, I always feel like I should qualify. I'm not saying there's bad faith on the part of academics or policymakers. I'm saying that we're locked into this process just in the same way in which one can talk about core economics and say, yes, it all depends on people's preferences, and use that as a rationale. And then when somebody says, where do those preferences come from? You would say, go to psychology for that. And then you go to psychology and you study and you find out, where do human preferences come from? But you say, well, why is there poverty? And then say, go to economics for that. Or, why is something wrong? Go to sociology for that. Just in the same way in which disciplinarity has carved up our concern in the knowledge domain, in a very similar way, nationalism has built walls around the way in which our policy can and does function. And the world of the future is not going to be a world where that can persist without, where that can continue as before, without imposing an ever greater cost on large numbers of people, not just faraway people, but people within our midst, people who are living in our societies, with us and next to us. I don't want to go about, I mean, there's a whole lot of, I think it's better to have the question and answer, because I think I'll just end up like saying more interesting things if you ask me questions, because it's rather than talk.
So we have about just over 5 minutes for questions.
You said that it wasn't a question of bad faith about this hegemony discourse you mentioned, but what are the causes of this sort of colonization of certain discourses in economics, particularly? And what can be done about it? What pressures are there on university, for example, increasing corporatization, pressures for funding, and how can that be escaped from?
Okay, maybe we'll take 2 more questions. Yeah, I'll do that.
You spoke about the machine-like structure of economics today, and in medicine you could trace that back to the mind-body split back in Descartes. Historically, where was that focus on looking at everything, how we then sort of would it be a means of the global elite to think more broadly about
I'm just wondering, from your experience in Bhutan, and I read an article, I didn't catch it on State of Facts over the weekend, but he had advocated against the whole organic thing in Bhutan, and how does that epitomize the kind of difference in somebody like Sachs, who's obviously in development, in how the development paradigms might be clashing?
Okay. The first one is the most difficult one, corporatization and funding. What does one do about it? It's we live in capitalism. It's a word that you'll not hear in academic discourse very much. It's not something we talk about, but it's apart from the ideology of it, it's simply a capitalism. It's simply we live in a system where capital determines everything. But what then is capital is not something that is as straightforward as it might seem. I mean, there's this in economics. There's this well-known debate called the Cambridge Capital Controversy called Cambridge because it was Cambridge in the UK and Cambridge in the US, and they were arguing about how do we how do we exactly conceptualize capital, and they did not reach a conclusion. But fundamentally, there's no justification for a system that there's no good enough justification for a system that only privileges the interests of capital always above the interests of labor, because if you were to hire the best example is if you were to hire a van from somebody and a person and employ both of them in order to conduct a robbery. The van is not going to be held to account or be charged in a court of law, but the person would be seen as an accomplice. So there is something different there is something fundamentally different with human agency that does not exist. So just by simply equating labor and capital as two factors of production is flawed because it's not a factor of production in the same way. One doesn't have to, there's a lot of course, there's the ghost of Marx is standing behind me, so I'm not telling you anything that you don't already know. But how does one deal with this in the course of in the context of institutions, perhaps not just universities, but any kind of institutions right now, is I think we try and Parliament, how does one deal with it in the context of political, funding in the US, for example, or any of that? I think just the work within the system to challenge the system, and to try and minimize the extreme amount of extreme dependence on the sources of capital, and to diversify where those sources of capital come from. So it's, if one has to apply for funding, then one has to apply for funding. But one can consciously always ask the question of, yes, well, where is this funding coming from, and what are the ways in which that enables or doesn't enable me to do certain things at an individual level. At an institutional level, I think the only thing that one can do is to constantly draw attention to the ways in which that this is not, it's not entirely justifiable to have. When it's the problem's not with the fact that one has to rely on sources of capital. I think the problem is how does one get to create that capital, and in order to create that capital, you need a system that doesn't impose a banking levy of 0.01% and cut welfare by 7%. You need a system that that doesn't allow just such blatant disparities where you have a bailout of billions and billions and then blame public spending for it. So you just have to keep making that argument in the public domain, in the scholarly domain, everywhere that you can. I don't think there's any other. I think we just have to deal with it as we must. The medicine thing, yes, exactly. I mean, I think the human sciences, just the natural sciences, the human sciences, they have this fascinating history. And in the book, I have this section called "The Worth of the Machine Metaphor," where it specifically goes back to Smith talking about the differences between systems and machines, and saying that. Sorry, I'm just going to find that. Half a minute less. 15 seconds. That the Enlightenment focused on knowing, and how it meant looking at nature or society as machines. So Smith writes. Smith said, Adam Smith, systems in many respects resemble machines. A machine is a little system created to perform, as well as to connect together in reality those different movements for which the artist has occasion for. A system is an imaginary machine invented to connect together in fancy those movements that are already performed. So it's allowing us to see what, perceive the world in terms of that machine metaphor. And by viewing something as closely tied to comprehending it in a mechanistic way, it also allows us to say that state, nature, society, market can all be conceptualized in this mechanistic manner. And I think the main problem with that is that it leads to a craving for systematizing the social, which is inherently not always systematizable. It leads us to carve entities such as the economy. The entity of the economy, for example, only comes into being in the 1920s when new powers of statistical planning, management, organization are coming into being. Just in the same way in which statistics itself only becomes important after the 1851 census, in Britain. So in the same way, in 1920s is the first time people start talking about the economy as a system, and we can see how powerful that became. It leads in the scholarly discourse to preferring a certain kind of formalism, which is confused with being rigorous, which is only if you look at it in terms of numbers. And numbers are very important, but as Mary Poovey argues, you cannot look at numbers as being somehow pre-interpretive and yet non-interpretive. That you have to be aware of how numbers get constructed as facts. So it's got the same sort of history in economics that it does in medicine. Going back to this nature of, but importantly, Smith was important in this, as well as the early statisticians like Richard Jones and others who looked at economic practice as being able to not just understand the world as a machine, but to be able to convert it into a machine, and then to be able to derive the benefits of that. To be able to invisibilize the moral considerations that would otherwise have been important if you didn't look at it as a machine, if you looked at it as something else, leading them to all sorts of crazy, interesting things, like talk about whether you should feed, all sorts of calculations like whether you should improve people's nutrition in order to make them better workers, or whether it's more profitable to boil urine, use it as a fertilizer, grow crops, and then it's just like these. History is fascinating, but these insane ways in which you really start to forget that we are actually talking about people before the worker gets constructed and the consumer and all of that. The Bhutan case and Sachs. Yes, I was actually in Bhutan, and I was actually in Bhutan last year, and when Sachs was there, and I challenged him on exactly this point. I agreed with a lot of what he said, but I fundamentally disagreed with with what he said about farming, because he seemed to be saying that organic farming isn't the way to go, and that you should have far more intensive agriculture, which is and reliance upon pesticides, which was wrong for a whole lot of reasons. And the person who was the preeminent Bhutanese intellectual, who's a common friend between me and Jeffrey Sachs, who organized his talk over there, everybody agreed. If you really know the context of the country, you see how wrong Sachs was on that. I think my last blog post is a long article about, which was from last year, about responding to Sachs on precisely this issue and arguing why that is wrong. For a whole lot of reasons. You do not have the kinds of technology to test for buildup of pesticides in crops in Bhutan, so it just would not work. The natural environment. I mean, it's a country that keeps that farming is very. It's a different kind of exercise in a lot of ways, because 60% of the country is to be under forest cover in perpetuity. So that means you're very constitutionally guaranteed. So there are very limited amounts of land where you can actually farm, and the kinds of things that you grow are very specific crops like potatoes and chilies. And it's for a whole lot of reasons that I talk about, 6 reasons in fact that I write about why that is wrong. And I don't think Sachs had much to say to that. He gave me his card and said, yes, we should. On this, I think he's on.
Okay, so on that note, just to thank you very much for a very engaging and provocative talk. So